So, Heather, another week in a semi-lockdown. It depends on where you are, but a lot of states are loosening. We are still probably a week or two away to get a sense of what impact this new phase of the dealing with the coronavirus will be. With that said, the story this week is or the biggest story. I mean, of course, we have stories. 40 million Americans now unemployed. One quarter of the of the working population is unemployed. We certainly have never had 25% unemployment rate in our lifetimes. We also, of course, have the election. There's some there's some stuff to report there, and the failure of the Republican Senate to do anything in terms of providing relief for Americans at this point. But the big story has been really a story that has been ongoing in many respects over the past, decade. And I say I limit it only in that regard because that has been the sort of advent of ubiquitous cell phone video, and we had a week or two ago the video came out of Ahmaud Arbery being shot in Georgia, and that took place several months ago. Earlier, I think it was this week. It was over the weekend. There was video of a woman in Central Park in New York City who was being videotaped by a black man who was out in a specific part of the Central Park, which is involves with bird watching, and had asked the woman to put her dog on the leash as what was required in that, particularly in that section of Central Park. And she responded by essentially seeking revenge by calling the police and claiming that he was attacking her, and specifically saying an African American man is attacking me. I mean, this is you don't have to have too much savvy to know that this is like the equivalent of what they call swatting. You're basically sicking the police on this man, and we had just within a day or two later a perfect example of why this is really in many respects like an act of I don't know, maybe terrorism is too broad a word because of the politics, but certainly an act to terrify someone and maybe worse, get them killed by the police, because a couple of days later in Minneapolis, video comes out of a man named George Floyd who was supposedly passing a counterfeit $20 bill. The police said he was resisting arrest. Video has shown that he has not. One of the police officers stuck his knee into George Floyd's neck, held it there for 10 minutes with George Floyd screaming that I cannot breathe, and held him in that position until he died. And so by the end of this week, we had riots happening in Minneapolis. We had some protests in California and in LA. I mean, we had protests all around the country, but there were protests became violent in Minneapolis because, in many respects, because of the police response. And here we are. Undoubtedly, the COVID crisis has enhanced the pressure. We also know that it is black and brown people who are dying disproportionately in this pandemic as a function of, as a almost like a litmus test of other societal ills that we have in this country that are revealed in in a crisis. And that's where we are. And I don't know. I mean, it's been a horrible week in that regard.
Oh, it really has been. And I would also add there's another incident that happened in Kentucky. A woman by the name of Breonna Taylor was killed by the police, who burst into her home, unannounced, and her boyfriend, she was there with her boyfriend, and he fired a gun in self-defense, thinking it was a home invasion, and it turned out to be the cops, and they just shot her for no good reason. And, she was an EMT, just a regular, worker who was working on the front lines doing emergency medical work. And that's another one. And of course, this happens all the time. And the difference in the two cases that you mentioned earlier, the Georgia case and then the Minnesota case, is that there's video, and the video, it always brings things, very much home, and it ends up the person in Minneapolis, and that whole situation was particularly gruesome because it just lasted so long. And I don't know if people have not seen the entire video of that, and you've just seen the clips they're showing on the news. I urge you to bear witness to this and watch the whole thing, because if you do, you can come away with no other belief that there was anything that justifies it. I would take issue with the idea that he put his knee on the guy's neck and held it there, too. If you watch the video, he didn't just hold it there. He ground his knee into that guy's neck over and over and over again. And when you watch the full video, what you see is that he cleared the man, Mr. Floyd. He passed out. It was obvious that he was passed out. He stopped responding in any way. For 4 minutes, that police officer ground his knee into his neck, and there can be no excuse that, it was in the fog of war, or, everybody, it was intense and whatever. It wasn't. There were people standing there filming it, talking about it, yelling at the cops, saying, "Look at him, he's passed out, you're killing him, look at that," and begging them to stop. So there's absolutely no reason on earth that this had to happen. It's absolutely grotesque, and it makes you wonder how often this happens. And I don't think you really even have to wonder. Years ago, I used to do a lot of writing about the taser torture that was going on with the cops when they first started using tasers. And there's a lot of that happens where, and you see in this case, one of the things that's most offensive about it is that as they're holding him down, as he's screaming and as he's begging for his mother and begging for help, they're saying to him, get up, which of course he can't possibly do because they're holding him down and his hands are in handcuffs. And this happens all the time. It's part of their training. They say stop resisting even as they're completely dominating them with a taser, or in this case, with a knee to the neck. So, it's horrifying. And, I think what you said also, by adding in the fact that so many of these COVID deaths are happening in the minority communities, as well as I would expect, and I haven't actually seen numbers on this, but the job losses must be falling very heavily on those communities too, because they, certainly they tend to be working in jobs that are either like in these meat packing plants where the disease is running rampant and there's nothing that anybody seems to be able to do about it, working in nursing homes as nursing aides, helping these elderly people, working in retail, working in fast food places, all these places where this virus is hitting hard in places of employment, and the layoffs are hitting hard. It is also hitting minority communities. So you can just imagine. I can only imagine, not being among them, but I can certainly see how this is just building up into an explosion. I can only imagine the frustration that they must feel. It's like, really? On top of everything else, now, we have to deal with all the rest of this stuff. They're killing us is what they have to be thinking. They're trying to kill us because they're dying, and they're dying in massive numbers, and it's absolutely horrifying to see. So, I have a feeling, Sam, that we're going to have a long, hot summer with a lot of unrest in a number of different ways.
Yeah, I agree. I think, we have this, there's just a tremendous amount of tension and anxiety. And I don't know what there is to say. That we still have this problem. It was a problem certainly that happened during the Obama years and happened before, well before. Look, we've had this problem in one variant or another from the founding of this country. But now we have videotape, and it is in some ways it's sort of like it is you can imagine the stages of sort of realization that we as a society have gone through, where it's like, well, no one's believing black people that this is their experience with police officers, and then finally there's a mechanism in which, like, here's you can believe them or your lying eyes type of situation when you have the video. And yet there is there any meaningful reform? I mean, during the Obama years, by the end of the Obama years, we had multiple police departments around the country that had consent decrees. We had multiple police departments around the country that were being, actively observed by the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division. Jeff Sessions gets in, completely reverses it, basically sends the signal that echoes what Donald Trump had said, which is, take your gloves off. Don't worry, we got you back. Which is not to say that this is a Donald Trump and a Republican problem, but there's not even the nod or even the attempt to mitigate the problem at all. And we have, like you say, I remember when you were documenting the police departments using these tasers as torture weapons. We have a real problem with policing in this country, and that doesn't mean all police officers. I don't even know if it means the majority, but it doesn't need to be to create this type of problem. And frankly, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it's certainly the having a fundamental shift in the way that we do policing in this country is obviously in need. I don't know if it means, abolish the police, but it's certainly, we need to abolish the way that they're trained. We need to abolish the way that they're represented, even by their unions, frankly, and the dynamics that exist on a local level. And we need greater accountability. I mean, there shouldn't be a moment's hesitation. That police officer should not only lose their badge, and they were fired by the mayor very quickly, but they should be brought up on charges as
Absolutely.
as fast as anybody else would be brought up on charges if there was videotape of them grinding their knee into a man's neck for 10 minutes while people are yelling, he's passing out, he's dying. I mean, the next thing that should have happened is one of those officers should have gone over there and put handcuffs on that officer who committed that, and then there should be an investigation and talk about accomplices. I mean, and until we have that level of accountability, there is no reason to believe that this stuff won't continue to happen. And that's not even, talking about the problem that was, sort of like so adroitly manifested. If you wanted to do, like, this is like a one act play, right? Where, you're that video from Central Park where this woman basically knows the reality of everything we've just talked about, knows the same reality that has brought people out in Minneapolis to protest and to, which has turned violent. She knows that reality as well as they do.
Yep.
And her response, however, is to leverage it and use it as a weapon, to weaponize that fear and that reality of being a black man, a black person in our society. I mean, never mind what she does at work. Never mind what she does in other parts. I mean, to do that and to be so naked about it, and to just like immediately move into that that zone in her head is just atrocious and so telling.
It certainly does illustrate what black people have been saying for decades, but recently in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is they poll people, and white people all say, oh yeah, things are getting a lot better for African Americans, with the sort of subtle implication that maybe they're complaining too much, and African Americans are going, no, this stuff is still happening. This is still in much the difference in the perceptions between the two are really stark. And I think a lot of people look at those numbers and go, what? Well, that incident in Central Park shows exactly how little things have changed. There's a white woman. She's, for whatever her reasons are, I don't know, maybe we don't know what motivated her to react so strongly to a simple request to leash her animal, whether she was afraid of the guy, and he's a bird watcher with a phone in his hand. It's not like he was, standing there with a gun.
Well, wait a second. Let's just, I want to remind you, everybody of one moment in that video where she starts to come towards him, and he says, please, do not come close to me.
Exactly. Get away.
It's very, very hard to maintain the attitude that I feel threatened by this person who is asking me to keep socially distant.
Exactly.
All right? I mean, I'm sorry. That's...
Well, and what was she doing? She did something that is so fundamental in American race relations, going all the way back, which is a white woman accusing a black man of, assaulting her.
This is Emmett Till stuff.
Threatening her. This is Emmett. This is it. We watched it. We watched it happening in 2020. It was filmed, and that made all the difference. But those kind of interactions, this woman using that, knowing in her mind that she could bring down the wrath of whatever, whether it was the vigilantes or the lynch mob or the cops or whatever the situation was, I'm going to tell them this African-American man is threatening me. And she said it that way. She said it as a threat. She didn't say it as, she didn't just pick up the phone and go, oh my God, there's an African-American man. She told him ahead of time. She goes, I'm going to tell them that an African-American man is threatening me. And then she went ahead and did it. And there was, this hysteria that sort of overcame this woman. I mean, I have no idea what was in her mind, but we know what the reality was. We saw it. There's no question about who this guy is or what he was doing there or anything else. It's very straightforward. So, when you see things like that, and that's how it struck me when I saw the video, I'm just going, even aside from the fact of her horrible cruelty to her poor dog,
right.
Was this feeling. I'm going, oh my God, this is Emmett Till. This is the modern version of that thing, and it keeps happening again and again and again. And you see it reflected in these other videos that you see of these and it's often these white women who are, accusing some, racial minority, of something, and they're going to call the cops, and it's being filmed, and you're going, geez, how deep does this go into our American cultural DNA, and how must it feel to be a black man or a teenage, a couple of teenage Hispanics just kind of walking down the street? How does it feel to be in that situation and know that this has been going on for centuries? And, so here you have it. And I watched those people the other night in Minneapolis, and, the first thing that happened when the cops descended on them because they were protesting was they started firing rubber bullets. They started, throwing tear gas as if this was a major violent insurrection instead of a protest. And you can't help but think about the contrast between those cops and how they handled the white protesters who showed up armed to the teeth, screaming in their faces in the middle of a pandemic which we know is transferred that way. All these white protesters protesting the lockdowns, and the cops, they just kept their cool, they just kept their distance, they just let it sort of unfold. They didn't just launch into some kind of violent reaction. But the minute those African American people came out in anger, the cops were right there, and they were ready to make it violent. And I honestly, my first thought when I saw the first night of protests when they came out, I thought they're going to punish these people now. They're going to punish the African American community for revealing this incident. That's what's
Yep.
really going through those cops' minds. I mean, maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe they really felt under threat, but it sure seemed to me like they came out loaded for bear.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it's just it is I mean, it is the frustration, is just completely understandable, and the anger is
Yeah.
completely understandable, and the reactions are completely understandable. I mean, I in the main am, you know, obviously I don't advocate any type of violence, and I generally sort of make these assessments of like, oh well, this won't be terribly helpful for anything or this and that, but in this instance, it is. I think it's impossible to to assess what's going on, and even for a moment, frankly, it's surprising in some ways that there hasn't been more violence and anger shown by communities of color, because it's just it just seems relentless, and it is. I think on some level, some of these communities are conditioned to take a lot more of this type of stuff than white
Sure.
people are. I mean, they are, but even in that context, people hit their limits, and so I mean, just an atrocious display, and I don't have a huge amount of confidence that Joe Biden necessarily is the person to deal with these things, but certainly Donald Trump is more than happy to have this happen. It seems to me, both ends of it, frankly.
Well, he's encouraged the cops to take violent
Yes.
action against people. He's encouraged it in the past,
Yep.
and he loves his cops. I mean, right now, he's kind of been saying this week, oh, I personally directed the FBI to look into this and whatever. He didn't do that. The FBI opened the case themselves. They don't take direction from the president in that regard. But nonetheless, he's trying to sort of, and I think he saw it originally as a way to curry favor, perhaps with the African-American community. He keeps trying to do these things to sort of paper over the fact that he's a stone-cold racist himself. It's not going to work. I mean, the black community knows exactly what they're dealing with in him. I mean, he's been pretty clear. But I'll be very curious to see how police, how he reacts when the police inevitably start pushing back on, what's happening in Minneapolis, on the heat that they're taking. They always do. Trump's base, many of them are racist. They're going to start pushing back, and we're going to see Donald Trump's true colors come out because there's just no doubt he is desperate at this point, in terms of his reelection prospects, to ensure that he doesn't do anything whatsoever to alienate even one member of his base. So I suspect that we're going to see something different coming from him. In the early days, I think he can sometimes sort of, see a political advantage until he finds out what they really think. And I don't think there's any doubt that we're going to see the right wing. They're going to do what they usually do, and they are the people. I mean, you think about it; those protesters that were out there, staging their insurrection over the government lockdown. I mean, think about it. What were they doing there? They were protesting the fact that they didn't have the freedom to go get a haircut or go into a bar
Right.
and have a drink whenever they want to and sit next to people and breathe all over them. This was their, these were their issues, essentially. I mean, they wanted everybody to go back to work. We all do. But their idea is that they shouldn't have to do any of these things because the government tells them to. And they were, lauded as heroes on the right.
Yep.
Those people were all doing great stuff, and they showed up with guns at in state houses and what have you. And the cops handled it very coolly and didn't bring anything.
Look, and part of that is just a function of who the cops are and where their
Of course, they're the same
ideological sympathies lie, and
Exactly.
And, obviously like broad structures of society in terms of what is considered acceptable and what is not. And, the idea of like, there's just, the bottom line is that one, I think like you're on an individual level, the cops, broadly speaking, much more willing, regardless of even the race of the cop, frankly, to presume a criminality of a person of color. Obviously, white cops have more of a proclivity for that. And then, but also from a structural standpoint, there is just a sense of like, there's no accountability. And there would be accountability. If we went after these white people with guns, there would be accountability. Like we would hear about this. This would be a problem for us. But you don't go and do what that white cop did to that black man by sticking his knee into the guy's, grinding it into his neck for that long. That's not, you don't do that unless you feel like you can get away with it.
Of course. And on camera, for crying out loud. I mean, he knew he was being filmed, and he did it anyway. Yep.
And some sense that he's done it before. I mean, before we go, I want to also talk about one other thing that's happened that, we've touched on a little bit. I mean, in terms of like these protests about the lockdowns. There's sort of a fascinating a dynamic that is shaping up. And look, we have no idea. In terms of the coronavirus, we can. I mean, let me put it this way. Let me put it in blackjack terms, since I missed my Vegas trip this year. When the dealer shows a 16 at blackjack, the odds are that the dealer is going to bust, and you bet accordingly. You bet based upon what card you have. You decide to take one or not, based upon the odds being that the dealer is going to bust. If the dealer doesn't bust, and you bet that essentially you had a bet that counted on them busting, it's still a good bet. It just happens that the odds are, whatever, 55% chance that you're going to win. And sometimes the 45% chance ends up turning up. We don't know what's going to happen with coronavirus over the next couple of months. But the odds are that it's not going to be good. It's quite possible it could be okay, that more people will be outside, that it doesn't transmit as easily in the 77 degrees or higher and whatnot. But that doesn't necessarily in any way mitigate the chances of a second wave. But with all that said, what's happening is this interesting dynamic that to have caution, and I mean caution like wear a mask, is becoming a part of the culture war. And I should say, like, it is really not a culture war as much as it is like a cultural assault, because the people who are wearing masks are not wearing masks because it is some type of signifier about any type of ideology, other than maybe a belief in science. But it really is just a notion of like, this is what you got to do to protect other members of society. I need to wear a mask. For the president, for the right wing, for the conservatives, for the Republicans in this country, it has become this sort of icon of weakness, of being a soy boy or being a liberal. I mean, literally being a liberal, because you are subscribing to this notion that we've got to be cautious in the face of a pandemic. There's a story out of Pennsylvania, and I'm not going to do it justice by talking about it. I mean, people need to find this and watch the video that a Democratic Pennsylvania state senator shot in his office after he found out about what I'm just about to tell you. Apparently, in the Pennsylvania State House has been the most active during coronavirus. It is also one of the most gerrymandered in the country, so that the Republicans control it, despite the fact that they had far less votes than would be commensurate with their representation in the state Senate. You'll recall that their congressional districts which were similar to the state Senate districts, were reversed by the state Supreme Court. They have not been able to do that with the Senate districts. I'm not quite sure why. They have been pushing to open up Pennsylvania extremely aggressively. They have been going on the floor of the Senate saying, this is not contagious. You don't have to worry about it. The Democrats are trying to destroy the businesses. Well, it has now come out that there were members of the Republican caucus in that state legislature who had COVID-19, who were contact tracing and isolating from their own families, but not telling the Democrats they were coming to work with in the State House. And so they were exposing, the only people they were exposing were their Democratic colleagues. And meanwhile, back at home, they're doing contact tracing and they're isolating from their own families for weeks. And they exposed people who have children, who have wives who are immunosuppressed. One of the man who shot the video, Sims, I think is his name.
Brian Sims is his
Brian
name.
Sims had secretly, because he didn't want it to be politicized, and he wasn't going to announce it until after his reelection in November, had secretly donated a kidney to a neighbor down the street because this person needed a kidney and he was a perfect match. Now, renal failure and kidney disease, which if you have one, definitionally, you have a vulnerability to any type of renal failure, any kidney disease, is one of the big comorbidities, and is the kidneys are particularly targeted by COVID-19. And this guy sat on a committee with that infected lawmaker, and was never told, and was just sat there. I mean, it is the pathology, the sociopathy that's involved in that is almost indescribable. And the idea that, there isn't national calls for all of those Republicans and all the people in leadership who knew about it to be, frankly, charged with criminal misconduct, but also to resign is beyond belief. And one thing that I just, want to make clear, that we have heard so much commentary over the past 3 years about how the Republicans are shaping themselves into Donald Trump, and or even Joe Biden saying that when Donald Trump is gone, then the Republicans are going to revert back to normal. The fact of the matter is, this is the Republican Party. Donald Trump is not the cause of the obscenity of the Republican Party. He is the product of it. And that needs to be, I think, more widely digested by the media and, frankly, much of the Democratic leadership. Joe Biden should be out there, as far as I'm concerned, calling for the resignation of all of those Republican leaders in that state house. It is, I can't even think of anything more demented, frankly.
It's completely outrageous, and this thing, it is clearly happening in ways that we're not even yet aware of. The North Dakota governor came out and made what I thought was kind of a strange plea at the time, which was, he said, don't shame people who are wearing masks. And he actually was in tears as he said it. They might have a 5-year-old who's undergoing cancer treatment or might be living with an elderly relative. Please don't shame people who are wearing masks. And I'm thinking, wow, where's that coming from? It was about a week ago, I think, that he said it. It's obvious that this is a very big deal on the right now. With this, what you're saying here, it's a weakness to tell anybody, and an almost wish in some ways. I don't know how else you can see it, to do harm to people. There's an actual part of this which is saying, I want to harm people my political enemies, with this virus. I want them to come to harm. You can't see anything like what happened in Pennsylvania in the State House, and I was shocked by it too, Sam. When I saw it, this guy Sims talking about it, I was going, "You've got to be kidding me!" I mean, they work with these people. They couldn't even, they know them. I mean, it's not even like, the sort of cavalier attitude of, spreading it to some stranger in a bar. I mean, these are people they work with every day doing that, and keeping quiet, all for political purposes. I have no doubt in my mind that this was purely a political choice, that they didn't want to disrupt their argument that the virus wasn't really that bad. But on some level, they had to know that they were doing harm because they were isolating themselves. So they had to know it. I mean, that is true sociopathy. I think that's what you're saying, is that within the right-wing culture now they've gone beyond just nihilism. I mean, they're actually seeking to do harm to people, and this virus is kind of exposing that, where it's just they're conscious of what they're doing. I guess that's what I'm saying. They know what this is. They know that it's not ignorance that's making people like that person, those Republicans in the Pennsylvania legislature. They know. They knew what they were doing. They had all the information. They were following it themselves, and just let their Democratic fellows in the legislature, just let them go out there and have no idea. And this guy Sims, he said he's immunosuppressed because of the kidney donation that he did, and who knows who else. I mean, there are people who've got elderly and any number of things. That's the thing about the virus. We don't know who this other person is or whether they've got it or whatever. So that's why you wear the mask. That's why you stay away. And so here we are. I mean, this is, like I said earlier, Sam, I think it's going to be a long, hot summer. I don't know exactly what way it's going to go or who's going to be at the center of it. Maybe a whole bunch of different people, but this social, sort of anger, unrest is starting to bubble up, and I don't know how that's gonna come out. Anyway.
Well, Heather, I wish I could say it was a fun time talking to you about this stuff, but and
by the way, we passed the 100,000 mark, so there's that.
Right. Well, hopefully we will adjourn, but we will return a week from now, and hopefully, maybe there'll be just a couple of moments of good news that we can talk about. But Heather, as always, I appreciate the time talking with you.
My pleasure, Sam. Anytime.